So welcome to Psychology to Live By. Today's another Q&A with some very practical people. Our topic's mental health part 2, how to manage mental health. Our participants have watched the podcast of that name, which you can see or listen to at my website, drchris.life. But I'll do a quick summary now before we get into our Q&A. So in part 1 of this series on mental health, we examined how we can go about helping colleagues and acquaintances if we see they're struggling with poor mental health. In part 2, we're now going to discuss how to handle the situation if we supervise or manage someone with a mental health issue at work. Now, as a manager, you always wear 2 hats. One represents your duty to manage performance, and the other duty is to care for your people. When you encounter mental health issues in the workplace, you still need to perform both duties. For example, you observe a worker's performance decline and you decide to address it. Now, it's often only at this point you might become aware that they have a mental health concern. So at this moment, you should take off your managing performance hat and very explicitly put on your duty of care hat. And then you conduct a helping conversation as we explored in part 1. And you should signpost this shift explicitly by saying something like, "Oh, I'm really sorry to hear you've been struggling, and I want to talk with you about what I can do to support you." Now, if the mental health issue is moderate and it's been well managed and you've conducted the above conversation, you can now explicitly put on your managing performance hat. Why? Because it's really well documented that staying at work and improving performance are far better for that person's mental health than, generally speaking, staying at home and thereby not improving performance. And again, you should signpost this by saying something like, "I now want to have a conversation in which I can support you to better perform in your role so you can have more success at work." Now, sometimes someone with a mental health concern might be detrimental to others in the workplace. This can be tricky, as they might be angry or behaving erratically or letting others down in terms of their work. You still have a duty of care to this person, but you also have a duty of care to those around them, and that includes you. So the podcast outlines strategies for modulating both empathy and consequences depending on that person's insight and remorsefulness. Even more tricky can be dealing with quite nasty people in the workplace who have what we would call maladjusted personality traits. These are personality types who cause a very high proportion of workplace conflict and distress. Typically, there is a pattern of conflict and interpersonal distress around them that extends across time and across relationships. What do? You lower your empathy and you don't go it alone. You work with others to contain their bad behaviour, and you never use explicit aggression. Now, normally we would de-escalate problems using a combination of appeals to reason and emotion. These won't work here. The best you can do is to contain and control their behaviours, as they're very unlikely to change, and they certainly can't change their personality. And hopefully, eventually, they'll tire of the constraints and will move on. All right, that's by way of summary, and now I'd just like to move us to the Q&A portion of our time together. And given the context where you all work in the same organisation, you're all senior, we've got an HR person, very senior people in the organisation, I'm assuming that you all have had these kinds of experiences of having to manage someone with a mental health concern. Would that be correct? Yeah. So who would like to kick off? I'm sure there's going to be some really curly questions here.
I can start.
Yeah.
I think it's really delicate, honestly.
Yeah.
I think everybody approaches things, comes from a problem or their issues from a different path. And
Yeah.
I think, ultimately the biggest challenge is when it starts to impact other people.
Yes.
And kind of drawing that line. But you want to be supportive, but not while sacrificing the position of other people. So I think, again, structure and being heard and doing everything that you possibly can is to help them is important, but there has to be a line that you have to draw.
Indeed. There's a biblical phrase that's been running around in my head while you're talking, Colin, and that is the wisdom of Solomon. It's really, you're right, it is delicate. And there is this balancing of, your duty of care, as well as your duty to, you're doing a job, to get performance. So maybe just a few general comments. There's a lot of variables here, right? It depends how long this issue has been there or how long it's continuing. It depends on how much it's interfering with performance. It depends how severe the mental ill health is. Now, so for obviously, if a person is psychotic or suicidally depressed or dangerously anorexic, that's a completely different conversation. You're now talking about the person, getting some really kind of heavy end clinical supervision and so on. So you're not really there. You're not getting to the managing performance hat. It's all about duty of care. But the vast majority of cases are not at that deep end of the mental health issues. They're in what we call moderate mental health issues. The person's still suffering, don't get me wrong, and there might be a diagnosis, but they're not that super dangerous or, completely disordered end. But it is delicate because when people are in a state like this, they're very sensitive, right? And if you jump into the performance stuff too quickly, that they're often going to, probably misperceive you as being uncaring and so on. But then it's delicate on the other side because
the varying degrees. I mean, because there are mental health and then substance, which I guess would fall into mental health, and that is
exactly. And look, I think one of the things is that as a supervisor, as a manager in a workplace, and as a worker, if someone has a mental health issue or a substance abuse issue, they've signed a contract to perform certain duties. And look, I know the legislation is different in different countries, but I think there's a broad commonality here that they're not being employed for charity, right? So they're being employed to fulfil certain duties. And in most jurisdictions, there have been changes in the workplace health and safety legislation in most Western countries, which recognises mental ill health in the same way as it recognises physical ill health. We're not going to expect someone to work if they broke their back, right? We're going to say they need to recuperate and then they come back to work, when they're better or they're recovering. So there's been that recognition. But nonetheless, there in all jurisdictions, it's not endless. If a person cannot, after the helping conversation, after getting help, after many attempts, still cannot meet the inherent requirements of the role. There's a practical line to be drawn there that they can't stay, right, because they can't do the job, right? But, the whole point is that we're doing everything we can possibly do to enable them to be successful at work. So what we're looking for, and you're right to call it delicate, we're looking for that sweet spot that's sort of like, like in a Venn diagram, you get the two overlapping circles where the work wins because they're now successful at their role. They win because being successful at their role is really good for their mental health, right? And as I suggested, there's a lot of studies that showed unequivocally that one of the important planks of good mental health is success in the world, success at work. And conversely, when people are not successful at work, it's really bad for their mental health. The status, the financial rewards, the engagement with our colleagues, all of these things. So I think that's the space we want to always try to get these conversations into, this mutual benefit of them winning and the workplace winning. All right. I'm sure I haven't touched on everything that was behind that. It's very delicate comment, but I might open it up to the other two guys.
Yeah, just kind of going along with what we were saying and like the duty to accommodate. I've found it very interesting as of late that employers are really opening up to an awareness around mental health and how it impacts, like giving people the tools and the support, especially in a manager position, to be able to deal with these types of situations. Like we have many managers within our organization who have never led people before. So as far as where I'm coming from our people operations standpoint, is giving those people the tools that if these things come up, that they have the support to be able to go down the road in addressing them. In things as far as supplying an EAP program for staff or funds for therapy, that kind of thing, that employers are really opening up to how, if we can support people, the connection between psychological safety and building high performing teams. And it's refreshing that there is this awareness and how we can in that idea of duty to accommodate, that we can supply these things and support for managers and employees.
Yeah, fantastic. There's so much to say on this topic, but first off, the research is very interesting that providing that sort of support for people, the dollar return on the investment is very high, as high as 5 to 1, like $5 saved for every dollar spent. So even just from that sort of financial, pragmatic angle, the costs of people not getting better are very high, not only for that person, but for their impact on everyone else. And then you've got all the costs of recruitment and, and so on, right? And all the sunk costs in their training and development, right? So there's a sort of very pragmatic dimension to it. But also increasingly, more and more, a higher and higher percentage of workers are knowledge workers. And, if you were a ditch digger, you could probably still dig ditches when you're unhappy. But if you're being paid to think and to make judgment calls, then it's very deleterious to your ability to function in the role. So increasingly, we want people to be able to think, to make judgment calls. So mental health becomes even more of an issue. But you're right. You mentioned EAP, so employment assistance programs. This idea of having some number of sessions, usually with a psychologist or a counsellor of some sort. And very often those sessions are also available to a family member because even there's a recognition if things aren't happy at home, how can that not affect the person at work? It's a much more enlightened phase, I think we're in now, that sees the whole person and the kind of community as a sort of functioning system. That mental health is also not just about individuals, both in terms of its effects, but also in terms of what may cause ill mental health. So there's a whole huge field of research that looks into what's called psychosocial factors. But it's pretty clear that most mental health is actually a response to quite difficult life factors. You know, relationship breakdown, bereavement, ill health, troubles in the workplace. So that, yes, some people have more susceptibility than others, but in terms of the levers we can operate in a workplace, these psychosocial risk factors that have now been identified, we can do lots of things about them. And that's where I think some of this stuff's come from, Karen, you know, the use of EAP. And the other little piece in what you're saying is about managers. And, you know, their skill set that got them to be managers or their expertise may not be the same skill set they need to be conducting a conversation with someone who's being very, very difficult. And part of the difficulty is they've got a mental health concern, and they've got to, as Colleen was saying, they've got to balance this very delicate balancing act between that and their duty of care to other people. And that's where the wisdom of Solomon really has to come in. And I think, you know, training around that and discussion is a really important focus. But again, it's not going to be only for these kinds of, its cash value is not going to be only for working with people with mental health. Just generally, those kinds of skills are wonderful skills for a manager to have, for people who are doing really nicely. Thank you very much. Yeah, so fantastic. What about you, Terry? What genius insights have you got for us?
I'm not sure whether I have any genius insights for you, but having been in a managerial type role for decades, I've definitely seen a lot of things.
Yeah.
And on that point of success, I think it's a double-edged sword, because people having success at work can do it through their own volition, or they can do it through stepping over others and stepping on others.
I see.
And if they're the supervisor of those other people, then those other people have really nowhere to go sometimes to express this without getting in trouble with their boss. So it creates this really sort of evil sort of thing that happens. And usually within senior management, you don't become aware of that till it's a real problem. Right? Now,
yes, because very often that manager who's got there by stepping over the top of others is quite good at managing up.
Exactly. And I think now with companies having more internal systems and the ability to go to HR in like a way that they don't have to name themselves, and that's opened up an avenue that frankly probably a decade ago just didn't exist.
Correct.
So I think that's been really, really helpful. But it's kind of interesting because I've seen this a number of times, and one of the first steps that I see in it is someone copies you on like an issue, and the supervisor's on it, and it might be because you asked to be copied on this type of issue, and then their supervisor gets really mad at them for copying you because you then chime in and say, well, you should think about doing it this way.
Yeah.
And then the supervisor, unbeknownst to you, rips that person.
Yeah.
And that to me is the first sign that they're over controlling, that they're stepping on people to get their own glory and sort of success. So I now know that that's one of these sort of signals. I'm just wondering, are there any others? Because sometimes this is the hardest thing to catch.
You're right. These questions are devilishly difficult. but so just a couple of general thoughts. I guess there's a lot more use of 360s these days, anonymous 360s. And so there's another avenue, especially if you do them with some frequency and you're getting the same feedback over time about the same people. The convergent validity of different sources of information all pointing in the same direction over time will tend to indicate. I mentioned there people with maladjusted personality traits. So I might use that to step into this question. If you're talking about a person who is sort of quite dominant, as you said, walks over the top of other people to be successful, that's a very different kind of success than the success I was referencing before. Just your common Joe who is doing a good job. But there you've got a sort of Machiavellian, disagreeableness. So, for example, even if you just look at personality traits, the research in people who are low in agreeableness, one of the big five personality dimensions, it's very, very clear that that people who are disagreeable, very low in agreeableness, rise higher in organisations. They're overrepresented as CEOs and in the exec suite, in the C-suite. And so, because one of the reasons is they're very ambitious and competitive, and they ask for more, and they're more entitled, and etc. So I was giving a talk once, Terry, to a group of they were the CEOs and the heads of HRs of financial institutions. There would have been 150, 200 of these people, so a lot of organisations represented. And the topic was talking about these dealing with difficult personalities in the workplace. And after the talk, a woman who came to me, she was the head of the HR of this sort of financial institution, and she said, "What do you do if you've got a sociopath, who's on the senior exec?" And I said to her, "Well, what makes you think," in this case it was a he, what makes you think he's a sociopath? And without almost drawing breath, she goes, "Well, A, B, C, D, E, F." Okay, fair enough. Okay. So then I said, "Well, how much money does this person bring into the organisation?" And it was a lot. Right. And I said, "Okay. And if you were to go against them, how many people in the exec would back you up?" And she said, "I'm not sure." Yeah. So sometimes, so her options were do nothing, have a crack, or leave. Right. So if the person's that senior, it can be very, very problematic. And it happens. Right. But in the situation you're describing, you're more senior to them. I think there are processes, and we've talked about, you'll get some feedback occasionally because you're going to be CC'd into communication. You've got the 360s. But also I think over time, Terry, you develop a bit of a nose for it. You watch for these sort of disagreeable behaviours, these self-serving.
Yeah, I think that's true. The hard part is when they might be in a satellite office, right?
Yeah.
So you don't necessarily see it. You don't necessarily sense it.
Yes.
And unfortunately, it gets to the point where it almost becomes a crisis, right?
That's right. Or it can sort of set the cultural tone of the.
That's a great way of saying it, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, of the whole office.
Yes.
So I think when you have satellite things, it obviously pays as a boss to pay him visits. But I think the 360s and reassuring people about the absolute confidentiality of them, where that's difficult is if you've only got a small number of people. because then the feedback can be identified or guessed at.
Well,
but, you know,
and I think the other wrinkle to think about it in a modern type company, where a lot of it's done digitally, kind of like this,
yes,
is you end up with people not in head offices, but all over the place.
yes,
And you're not necessarily tied into how they actually interact with each other.
no,
And that opens up a whole other mess of situations that within inside an office space, a physical office space,
so
might be more moderated.
I guess, I mean, it's true. I guess all I can say here is that, you know, the indicator that you're dealing with a problematic personality, if I put it in those terms, is this dual thing, that you begin to notice a pattern that extends across time, and the pattern extends across different relationships. Right? So around a person, you see a number of relational problems, and you see that pattern across time. We'd all like to pick that up a lot sooner, but just at a practical level, you frequently cannot. But once you do, I think you can have more confidence that you're dealing with a personality issue that's unlikely to change.
It makes me wonder, and I'm shooting in the future, if they've got AI technology that can see breast cancer years before it comes.
Yeah.
I wonder if they can create something that's not going to create a litigious nightmare to see, you know, who, you know, we always like to say we really don't want not nice people.
Exactly.
So if there was a not nice people AI filter, that would be awesome.
I'm skeptical.
Of course you
are. But maybe it's self-interested to do me out of, you know. But no, I think that once you do identify something like this, as I say, you never go it alone. You know, you have to sort of play hardball. There has to be negative consequences. People like that can pull their head in if there's negative consequences. They're less likely to pull their head in if you're just appealing to them, right? It has to be constraint, right? And in a way, they understand that. In a way, they don't understand appeals to emotion or appeals to reason, okay? And that just seems to be the way of the world with some people, not the majority. So our mainstream way of operating is appeals to reason and emotion, but not for a small percentage that have this disproportionately negative effect on the people around them. They cause the mental health problems in people. That they are one of the psychosocial factors that I was talking about. All right, but we've just taken the lid off a big can of worms here. And
I can just see Karen chomping for more and more stuff here. She lives it. I mean, you've got a great group for this conversation because we've all experienced it.
Exactly.
We've all lived it, and we've all had to deal with it. So
yeah, and I sold a business 4 years ago that we ran for 14 years that was, you know, it was a workplace mental health and wellbeing business, and it was really about how to manage psychosocial factors in the modern workplace. Yeah. You know, it's, as this conversation has revealed, it's not facile. It's not a simple matter. There's not going to be really neat answers, but I think the general principles are good. And that when we do eventually discover mischief that you've described, Terry, that we can be less, we can be unambiguous in the way we go about it. We can be more decisive. Yeah. All right, guys, speaking of which, I better be decisive about time. Once again, thank you so much. Thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. I hope our listeners enjoy it and get plenty from it. And I look forward to our next conversation. I don't know what that'll be about, but I'm sure it'll be good. And, I look forward to seeing you again. Bye now.